In the peaceful suburb of Austin, Texas, the Johnson family appeared to embody the American dream. Robert Johnson, a 45-year-old successful entrepreneur, was known not only for his business acumen but also for his kind-hearted nature. His gentle demeanor and a penchant for helping those around him made Robert well-liked in the community. His marriage to the much younger and attractive Linda Johnson seemed perfect on the surface. Linda, 35, was the picture of elegance and charm, making her a frequent subject of admiration at social gatherings. However, behind closed doors, their marriage was anything but ideal. Robert suffered from a condition that, while never openly discussed, left Linda deeply unsatisfied. A weakness he compensated for with material comforts and a lavish lifestyle. Michael Johnson, Robert's 18-year-old son from a previous marriage, was the picture of obedience. A quiet, introverted young man, Michael was known for being dutiful and eager to please. He lived in the shadow of his father's expectations, doing his best to stay out of trouble and avoid conflicts. Though his life seemed ordinary, Michael harbored a deep-seated anxiety about disappointing those he cared for, particularly his father. But on a balmy summer morning, the Johnson family's carefully maintained facade shattered. Robert's body was discovered in his car, submerged in a lake near their home. All signs pointed to suicide, a desperate act by a man weighed down by personal and professional pressures. But as Detective James Carter of the Austin Police Department began to peel back the layers of this seemingly straightforward case, he uncovered a web of secrets that would reveal the darker side of human nature and the devastating consequences of unchecked desires. The sun had barely risen when the call came in. Detective James Carter, a seasoned investigator with a sharp mind and a keen eye for detail, was already on his third cup of coffee. The early morning stillness of his modest office was abruptly shattered as he picked up the phone. The news was grim. Robert Johnson, a prominent local businessman, had been found dead in his car, which was submerged in a lake just outside Austin. Carter's mind immediately began piecing together the fragments of the story as he drove to the scene. Robert Johnson, successful, well-respected, a man with everything to live for. Why would he drive his car into a lake in what appeared to be an act of suicide? As he arrived at the sight of the submerged vehicle sent a chill down his spine. The car had been pulled halfway out of the water, revealing a crumpled hood and shattered windshield. Robert's lifeless body was still inside, his seatbelt securely fastened. As Carter approached, he was struck by the eerie calm that surrounded the lake. The water was still, undisturbed except for the ripples where the car had been dragged out. It was as if the world had paused in mourning for this man who had seemingly lost all hope. The initial signs pointed to a straightforward case of suicide, a tragic end to a life burdened by unseen pressures. But Carter, ever the skeptic, couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story than met the eye. Carter began by examining the scene, his experienced eyes scanning for anything out of place. The car itself was a luxury sedan, well-maintained, with no signs of a struggle. Inside, the dashboard was pristine, save for a single piece of paper resting on the passenger seat. Carter carefully picked it up, reading the short, cryptic message written in Robert's neat handwriting. "I'm sorry. I can't do this anymore." It was a standard suicide note, yet something about it felt off. The words were too concise, too final for a man known for his thoughtfulness and attention to detail. Carter's gut told him there was something more to this, something beneath the surface that wasn't immediately apparent. As he pondered this, a police officer approached, giving Carter a brief update. "Neighbors reported hearing nothing unusual last night," the officer said. "No signs of foul play, but there was a witness who mentioned seeing the car leave the Johnson residence late last night. No one knows why he would drive out here, though." Carter nodded, his mind already working through the possibilities. He knew he needed to speak with Robert's family, particularly his wife, Linda, and his son, Michael. Their insights might provide clues about what had driven Robert to this tragic end. or reveal that things weren't as they seemed. When Carter arrived at the Johnson home, the scene was one of grief and confusion. Linda Johnson, dressed in a black silk robe, her face pale and drawn, was seated in the living room, surrounded by neighbors who murmured words of comfort. She looked up as Carter entered, her eyes red from crying. "Mrs. Johnson, I'm Detective Carter," he said softly, sitting down across from her. "I'm very sorry for your loss, but I need to ask you a few questions." Linda nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Of course. I'll do anything I can to help." As Carter spoke with Linda, he noted the details of her appearance, how she kept nervously twisting the hem of her robe, how her eyes seemed distant, as if she were struggling to comprehend the reality of her situation. She explained that Robert had been under a lot of stress lately, particularly due to some business deals that hadn't gone as planned. He had become withdrawn, irritable, and had started spending more time alone. We had our problems," Linda admitted, her voice cracking. "But I never thought he would do something like this. I didn't know he was so unhappy." Carter nodded, listening intently. "What about last night? Do you remember anything unusual? Did Robert say or do anything out of the ordinary?" Linda shook her head. "No, he seemed fine when we went to bed. I fell asleep early. When I woke up, he was gone. I thought he might have gone for a drive to clear his head, but then—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Carter could see the genuine pain in her eyes, but there was something else there, too. Something she wasn't saying. He decided to shift his focus for the moment and speak with Michael. Michael was in his room, sitting on the edge of his bed, staring blankly at the floor. The young man looked even more fragile than his stepmother, his face pale and drawn. Carter approached him cautiously, not wanting to startle him. "Michael?" Carter began gently. "I'm Detective Carter. I'm here to find out what happened to your father. Can you tell me anything about last night? Anything at all?" Michael looked up, his eyes wide with fear. I don't know," he stammered. "I went to bed early. I didn't hear anything. I didn't know anything was wrong." Carter studied the boy's face, searching for any signs of deception. But all he saw was fear. Fear and guilt, though Carter couldn't yet tell what the guilt was for. He decided not to press Michael too hard, knowing that the young man was likely overwhelmed by the situation. "Thank you, Michael," Carter said softly. "If you remember anything at all, please let me know." Michael nodded silently, his gaze dropping back to the floor. Carter left the room, his mind racing with possibilities. There was something off about this family, something hidden beneath the surface. He needed to dig deeper, but he had to be careful. One wrong move, and the truth might slip through his fingers. Over the next few days, Carter threw himself into the investigation. He reviewed Robert's business records, spoke with his colleagues and friends, and even combed through his personal life for any clues that might explain why a man like Robert Johnson would choose to end his life in such a tragic way. The more Carter learned, the more he became convinced that Robert's death was not the result of a simple suicide. For one, Robert's business troubles, while significant, were not insurmountable. He had faced setbacks before and had always managed to bounce back. His colleagues described him as resilient, a man who thrived under pressure. They were shocked to hear that he might have taken his own life. But it wasn't just the business aspect that bothered Carter. There was also the issue of Robert's marriage. Linda had portrayed their relationship as strained but not beyond repair. However, when Carter dug deeper, he found hints of something darker. Friends of the couple mentioned that Linda had often seemed unhappy in her marriage, though she never spoke of it openly. There were whispers that she had confided in a close friend about her dissatisfaction, particularly with Robert's inability to fulfill her needs due to his condition. Carter also kept a close eye on Michael. The boy was withdrawn, avoiding contact with anyone outside the family. Carter couldn't shake the feeling that Michael was hiding something important. He tried to get the young man to open up, but each time, Michael clammed up, his anxiety palpable. As Carter delved further into the family's dynamics, he decided to take a closer look at Linda's background. He obtained a warrant to search her phone records and email accounts, hoping to find some clue about her relationship with Robert and possibly Michael. What he found was far more than he had expected. The emails and text messages between Linda and Michael were shocking. They were filled with flirtatious language, secret meetings, and promises of affection that were wholly inappropriate for a mother and son. Carter's mind raced as he read through the correspondence, realizing that this wasn't just a case of a troubled marriage, it was a twisted, illicit relationship that had likely contributed to Robert's death. But how had it started? What had driven Linda to cross such a boundary? And how had she managed to ensnare Michael in this dark web of deceit? Carter's instincts told him that Robert had discovered the affair, and that discovery had played a key role in his death. But he needed more evidence, something concrete that could link Linda and Michael to the crime. Carter knew that confronting Linda directly was risky, but it was a risk he had to take. The information he had uncovered was explosive, and he needed to get the truth from Linda before she had a chance to cover her tracks. He arranged to meet her at the Johnson home, hoping to catch her off guard. When Linda answered the door, she looked different, tired, almost defeated. The elegant, composed woman Carter had met just days earlier was gone, replaced by someone who seemed on the verge of collapse. She invited him in, and they sat down in the living room, the tension between them palpable. "Linda, I need to ask you some difficult questions," Carter began, choosing his words carefully. "I've been looking into your relationship with Michael, and I've found some things that concern me." Linda's eyes flickered with fear, but she quickly masked it, meeting Carter's gaze with a steady stare. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice calm. "I'm talking about the messages between you and Michael," Carter said, his tone firm. "The ones where you discuss meeting in secret, where the tone is inappropriate." For a moment, Linda said nothing, her face a blank mask. Then, slowly, she let out a bitter laugh, her composure slipping. "So you found out," she said, her voice tinged with resignation. "I suppose it was only a matter of time." Carter remained silent, letting her continue. "It started about a year ago," Linda admitted, her voice hollow. "Robert was away on a business trip, and Michael and I were home alone. I was feeling lonely, frustrated. Robert's condition, it made things difficult between us. And Michael, he was always so eager to please, so sweet." She trailed off, her eyes filling with tears. "One night, I had too much to drink. I wasn't thinking clearly, and I made a mistake. Michael was just a boy, but I took advantage of him. And after that, it kept happening. I couldn't stop." Carter felt a surge of anger mixed with pity. Linda had manipulated Michael, using his vulnerability and need for approval to satisfy her own desires. But there was still one question that needed answering. "Linda," Carter said gently, "did Robert find out?" Linda looked up, her eyes red and swollen. "Yes," she whispered. "He found out a few weeks ago. He confronted me about it. He was furious, said he was going to leave me, expose everything. I didn't know what to do." Carter's heart pounded as he asked the next question. "And what happened the night he died?" Linda hesitated, then shook her head. "I didn't kill him," she said, her voice trembling. "I swear I didn't. But Michael was the one who came up with the plan to make it look like a suicide. He said it was the only way to protect us." Armed with Linda's confession, Carter knew he needed to speak to Michael one last time. The young man had been through so much, and Carter dreaded what he might uncover in this final interview. He found Michael in his room, the curtains drawn tight, blocking out the morning light. The air in the room was heavy, with the scent of stale air and unwashed clothes, as if the boy had been sitting there, unmoving, for days. "Michael," Carter began, his voice soft, "I know about you and Linda. She's told me everything." Michael's reaction was immediate and visceral. His face turned ashen, and he let out a small, choked gasp, as if the air had been sucked from his lungs. He didn't speak, but his hands trembled violently, his fingers curling into fists. Carter approached slowly, sitting down on the edge of the bed beside Michael. "I'm not here to judge you," he said gently. "I'm here to help. But I need you to tell me what happened. I need you to be honest with me." Michael stared down at his hands, his knuckles white from the pressure of his grip. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible, each word forced out with immense effort. I didn't want any of this," he murmured. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I just wanted to be a good son." Carter waited patiently, sensing that Michael was on the verge of a breakthrough. The boy had been carrying this weight alone for far too long, and it was time for him to unburden himself. "Dad, he found out about us," Michael continued, his voice trembling. "He was so angry. I've never seen him like that before. He told me I was no longer his son, that he was going to send me away, divorce Linda, and ruin her life. I didn't know what to do." The words tumbled out in a rush, as if once he started, Michael couldn't stop. "Linda was scared. She said if Dad exposed us, we'd both lose everything. She convinced me that the only way out was to make it look like he killed himself. That way, no one would ever know." Carter's heart ached for the young man before him, so clearly manipulated and broken by the people he should have been able to trust. But there was still more to the story, and Carter needed to hear it. "How did you do it?" Carter asked quietly. Michael swallowed hard, his hands now shaking uncontrollably. "Linda gave Dad a sedative in his drink that night," he confessed, his voice trembling. "After he fell asleep, we put him in the car and drove it into the lake. Linda made it look like he had driven there himself. I didn't want to do it, but she said it was the only way." The confession hit Carter like a punch to the gut. He had suspected there was more to this case, but the reality was far darker than he had imagined. Michael, so young and vulnerable, had been drawn into a twisted relationship that had ultimately led to his father's death. Carter took a deep breath, fighting to keep his emotions in check. "Michael," he said softly, "I know this isn't easy, but you did the right thing by telling me. We'll make sure that the truth comes out." Michael looked up at Carter, his eyes filled with despair. "Will I go to jail?" he asked, his voice trembling. Carter hesitated, knowing he couldn't lie to the boy. "There will be consequences," he said gently, "but I'll do everything I can to help you. You've been through a lot, and the court will take that into account." Michael nodded numbly, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of the world had finally crushed him. Carter stood, feeling a mixture of relief and sorrow. The truth was out, but at what cost? With the full story in hand, Carter knew what had to be done. The next few days were a blur of paperwork, interviews, and meetings with the district attorney. The case against Linda was strong. She had manipulated Michael, orchestrated Robert's death, and tried to cover it up as a suicide. Michael's confession, combined with the physical evidence, painted a clear picture of her guilt. The day of the arrest was overcast, the sky heavy with the threat of rain. Carter, accompanied by a team of officers, returned to the Johnson home. Linda answered the door, her face pale and drawn. She didn't resist as the handcuffs were placed around her wrists, her eyes empty as if she had already accepted her fate. Michael watched from the doorway, his expression blank. Carter approached him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You did the right thing, Michael," he said softly. "It's going to be hard, but you'll get through this." Michael didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the spot where his stepmother had stood moments before. Carter could see the devastation in the boy's eyes, the crushing realization of what he had lost: his father, his family, his innocence. Linda was led away in the back of a police cruiser, her once proud head bowed in shame. Carter watched her go, a sense of finality settling over him. The case was closed, but the damage it had caused would linger for years to come. The trial was swift and decisive. Linda Johnson was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The evidence was overwhelming, and her own confession sealed her fate. Michael Johnson, due to his age and the manipulative influence of Linda, received a reduced sentence. The court recognized that he had been a victim as much as a perpetrator, and he was sentenced to serve time in a juvenile facility until he reached adulthood, followed by probation. The case of Robert Johnson's death became a cautionary tale in the Austin community, a story of how even the most seemingly perfect lives could be torn apart by hidden darkness. Detective James Carter moved on to other cases, but the memory of the Johnson family's tragic downfall would linger in his mind, a reminder